Good evening. My name is John Carr, and I am director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. We're delighted you're here, delighted so many are here. We've tried to pick out an evening where nothing would be going on in Washington. You know, 2 impeachment panels, a debate with 10 Democrats. If you're really obsessive, you can listen and get a drink and still make it home in time for the debate. And you can fight about what happened on the Hill today. I want to thank our partners at the School of Continuing Studies. As I said last night, they are doing remarkable work that advances the mission of Georgetown in ways most people don't understand. At the initiative, we work to promote dialogue on Catholic social thought and national and global issues, to build bridges across political, religious, and ideological lines, and encourage a new generation of Catholic lay leaders to see their faith as an asset in pursuing the common good. Tonight, I think we advance all those 3 objectives. We have found there's a hunger for principled civil dialogue in this demoralized capital and in our wounded church. In 6 years, our initiative has organized more than 80 gatherings drawing more than 30,000 people. We have especially learned that young leaders are looking for a moral vocabulary to help them bring together their faith and their work, their personal and professional lives. This is why these Salt and Light gatherings for Catholic leaders under 40 are so important, and tonight's turnout is so encouraging. How many are here at their first Salt and Light gathering? Well, welcome. We want you to come back. The price for the reception is making sure that we have your email and that you might send us the names and emails of your friends who might be interested in this. Kim is going to offer more detailed introductions, but for now I just want to thank and welcome this remarkable panel. This is the A-team, as I'm sure you're aware, and it's for the Salt and Light gathering. And there are a lot of old people like me who are really mad that this group is here at a Salt and Light gathering, not up at Georgetown. We decided, given the complaints we had received, that we would live stream this. So there are a lot of old people asking their children, what is a live stream right now? We have with us New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. We have papal biographer Austin Ivory. By the way, Austin's new book you can purchase, and I think you can probably get Austin to sign it upstairs. Author and speaker Leo Labresco-Sargent, and Matt Sitman of Commonweal, who I think has a Georgetown connection as well. They bring differing perspectives on the challenges facing both our nation and church. As we think about those challenges, we think about the last decade. Probably 2 of the most surprising things that have happened in a frankly stunning decade are the election of Pope Francis and President Trump. They are both outsiders, but in other ways they could not be more different. We hope tonight's conversation will explore how the opposing messages, contrasting messages, better way to put it, of the leader of our country and the leader of our church challenge American Catholics, who are both American and Catholic, on issues of nationalism, democracy, and global responsibility. Related to Pope Francis, I invite you to join us at Dahlgren Chapel tomorrow evening for a remarkable session on the Francis factor today with our new Archbishop, Wilton Gregory, and Helen Alvarez and Kim Daniels and I will also be a part of the conversation. Both Ross and Austin have been a part of our Francis Factor dialogues in the past. This will be in the chapel at 5 o'clock tomorrow evening. There'll be a nice reception thereafter. We look forward to this dialogue because we need it. These are tough times in a lot of ways, but we cannot be without hope. As we gather for our last Salt and Light gathering, it was on the night the Nationals were playing for a division championship. They came back to win that game and went on to the World Series. So there's another proof that miracles are possible. My favorite new theologian is Davy Martinez, the Nationalist manager, who said, bumpy roads can lead to beautiful places. I hope that's true, because in our church and nation, we are on very bumpy roads, and we are not at a beautiful place. This capital is paralyzed, our church is wounded. Basic obligations of telling the truth, protecting human life and dignity, defending the weak and vulnerable are ignored day after day. What does this mean for young Catholics in our capital? How do the concepts and realities of democracy and nationalism, do they provide a way out of this mess, or do they make it worse? Finally, I'm happy to introduce my colleague and our moderator tonight. Kim Daniels began her work at the intersection of politics and faith as a student at Princeton and the University of Chicago Law School. She continued her work as an attorney focused on religious liberty and pro-life matters. She worked at the U.S. Bishops' Conference as a spokesperson and an advisor not only on those issues, but on immigration, poverty, and Pope Francis' environmental encyclical. In 2016, she was appointed by Pope Francis as a member of the Vatican Secretariat for Communication. She is also a mom of 6 kids, which may be her most demanding and important responsibility. Last year, after 5 years of appeals from me, she had joined the initiative as our associate director. She is a leader in all our efforts, but she has a particular focus on the Assault and Light gatherings. So Kim, thank you for your leadership in putting this together, and let's get started.
Thanks, John. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thank you. We are really looking forward to this conversation, and we've been looking forward to it for a while. There's so much to talk about here tonight, as you know, and we hope you all will join the conversation. We'll have a question and answer period later. Please follow us on Twitter at #CSTNationalism. So nationalism, post-liberalism, Pope Francis, not much to talk about there, right? Really narrow topics, and I'm sure I'm not going to be able to get any opinions out of any of these folks up here. Obviously, there's so much that's been written on these topics. Ross, I think, called this conversation a full employment act for a certain set of commentators. And I think it's also true to say, right, that you could take any term in the title, and scholars spend their careers studying subsets of those terms. Obviously, that's not what we're here to do tonight. We're here to have a different conversation. We're here to have one where all of us can access that conversation and learn something from it. I'm here at the beginning. I want to help frame it. I want to get us started in a very brief way, and so we can get right into the conversation. But I want to give us a little bit of a background on that, so we're all starting from the same baseline. So it's not news to any of you, right, that we are in a time of real political volatility. And that goes from the impeachment hearings today and the election coming up, but more importantly, economic and cultural and social dislocation. For many people, it feels like moral norms that just yesterday were accepted by everybody have changed at the drop of a hat. For many others, it feels like economic inequality is rising, that some people are winning in this economy, but others are not. Others are being left behind, and in particular, the most poor and the most vulnerable among us. You see this kind of fracturing of community that people often really feel in their lives, and I know Leah has written about that quite a bit in her book, which is also on sale upstairs. Against all that, we have a lot of political instability going on. When I try to think about this, I think of some images that have become iconic for me in the past few years. Maybe the face of a victim of the opioid epidemic. Maybe we think about the Amazon burning or California burning. The father and daughter who drowned crossing the Rio Grande River. How about the line of people stretched around the block trying to get a handful of jobs at a big box store that's opening? Or how about the couple who's pushing a puppy in a baby stroller and not a baby? Those are the kinds of things I think about that drive the instability and the fractured moment that we're thinking about right now. It's caused ideological ferment on the left and on the right. And I think on the left, you see a lot of focus on economic issues as the drivers of these big developments. And on the right, you see an increasing acceptance of those economic critiques. And at the same time, you see a focus on cultural issues as well, and the loss of community and the loss of solidarity. We've talked a lot about the idea in these conversations that have been going on about liberalism. And maybe there's a certain set of people who think the liberal order that we live in, the way we live our lives, is a big driver of some of this corrosion of moral norms and some of the corrosion of community. Some people have even critiqued those liberal norms themselves and said we need to move beyond them. A lot of people critique free markets as a big cause of this as well. I think that we'll talk a little bit more about how to define liberalism and what we mean by that. We'll let the panelists do that. But I want to be sure, I'll leave that to them. But I do want to be sure that we want to talk about this as a sense of our constitutional order and individual rights and what supports our sense of a healthy pluralism, or can we even have that anymore? The economic developments and cultural developments I talked about have also led to growth of nationalist movements both here in the US and abroad, and we can look at that across Europe. You can look at that in Brazil. Of course, you can look at that here in the United States, where President Trump just, I think, 2 weeks ago tweeted out that he liked that the word nationalism was becoming more mainstream. And there are a lot of people who really think about this idea, have given a lot of thought to how we bring that into this conversation today. So it's not just nationalism in the sense of patriotism, right? It's a sense of national solidarity, a search for an identity in the nation as opposed to this global order. And there are writers and thinkers who have done a lot of work thinking about how we bring that to this current conversation. And others who've said that in the wake of those kinds of issues, you're always going to be trailing racism and nativism. So those are issues we'll get into tonight. It raises a host of questions. Catholics have been at the center of these questions, and that's not a surprise, right? We bring so much to the conversation. We are a global church, and we're on the ground so much. And on the ground, we have local experience with dealing with all of these fractured communities and economic inequality. We have a long and very checkered history of engagement with nationalism and liberalism. And we also have Catholic social thought, which gives us a vocabulary and an architecture for thinking about how we address these questions. So I like to talk about that in particular tonight, what I think the initiative can bring to this conversation uniquely, because I think there are a lot of different lanes we can address it. But what we bring to this is an attempt to talk about it with a group of people who share so much in common and at the same time have some real differences, number one. And number two, to look at it through the lens of Pope Francis, who brings a really interesting perspective to the conversation, right? Because on the one hand, he is a real advocate for migrants. He talks about the inequality and the harms caused by globalization. And when I think of an iconic image of him, I think of him in the midst of a crowd of joyful poor people, right? Whether it's in Mozambique or whether it's in Bolivia or the Philippines. But I don't want to sort of present that as the image of Pope Francis operative here. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that. So I'd like to get to that story right now. By starting to talk with our panelists. And I think that so many times Catholics like to tell themselves the story of decline, right? Everything is terrible and everything is going south from there. When I look at the people we have up here today to talk about this issue, what I like to think about is how much we bring to the public conversation these days, because we have such a remarkable group of people. Austin Ivory is the leading biographer of Pope Francis with The Great Reformer and a new book out called Wounded Shepherd. And Leah Libresco, and by the way, Austin also did his dissertation on on Argentinian Catholicism, so he brings a lot to understanding Pope Francis in particular. Leah Libresco Sargent has written a book called Building the Benedict Option, but what I love about Leah is that she's written in journals from First Things to America to Commonweal, and I'm leaving a lot out, the American Conservative and others. She's really hard to pigeonhole. And she talks about not just talking about community, but building it. You all know Ross Douthat as the columnist at the New York Times. He's the author of To Change the Church, and I would say a leading critic of elements of the Francis papacy and a leading conservative voice in this country for a long time. And I'll look forward to engaging with them.
Leading is such a strong yeah.
Finally, my friend Matt Sitman, who is an editor at Commonweal, writes at Dissent, and also is the host of the Know Your Enemy podcast, which is just a terrific look at the American right. And Matt comes from the right. It is. It's a great, and it is. Matt comes from.
You can know and love your enemy.
You can know and love your enemy. The title is, the name, I think it's fair to say, is tongue-in-cheek. And Matt comes from the right, and he comes from a fundamentalist Christian childhood, is now a Catholic on the left, and that move, I think, is really interesting for our conversation as well. So with that, let's get started. And I want to get started first with you, Austin, because I think I want to talk a little bit about Pope Francis. You give us your perspective on how Catholic social thought informs these questions, and particularly through the lens of Pope Francis. Let us know a little bit about how his thought hangs together as an integrated whole here.
Well, thanks, Kim. Thank you, John. Thank you all for this great opportunity to discuss this pressing issue very much of the moment with this astonishingly distinguished panel. Great to be here. I'm going to, without trying to define any of these terms, I just want to say, first of all, Francis is not a globalist. It always makes me laugh when Steve Bannon and others describe him as such. He is the world's leading critic of a certain model of globalized technocracy, which puts profit at the expense of everything else, which is happy to rip up the rainforest for the sake of a model of consumerism, which results in a culture of waste, rising inequality, and all the rest of it. He's been a persistent critic and is probably the world's best-known advocate of an alternative to that. But equally, he's not a nationalist, at least not in the sense of what we now understand as national populism. Although, and I can get into this later if you want, he has in many ways a nationalist background as an Argentine, in the sense that he's always identified with the national popular movement in Latin America, which is something, however, very different from what we might call national populism now. So if national populism is the attempt to rub salt on the wounds of the grievances of the contemporary world, to turn people of a particular country against another group of people who they want you to believe are a threat and who offer to protect you from them, again, you have to say Francis is probably the world's leading critic of that kind of xenophobic nationalism. So where do I situate him? Well, he's in that long, great tradition of social Catholic thought, and I don't think that in what he advocates in terms of an alternative to the existing model is so different from previous popes. But here's what he brings to the table, which I think is a bit different. He leads something now known as the popular movements. It's a remarkable phenomenon, very hard to describe. But in a sense, he's held these big movements, these big meetings, with groups of people who one might call the victims of the throwaway economy. That's to say, landless workers, unemployed people, garbage collectors, and so on. If you like, the people at the very bottom. And he says to them, you are the protagonists of building a different kind of future, a different kind of economy. In that sense, this is a practical antidote to populism, in that rather than being instrumentalized from above, he's making the people below the architects of their own destiny. That's one. Second concrete thing he does to counteract the forces, one might say, of national populism, is he's probably the world's leading advocate of migrants. And not just immigration in general as a concept, but migrants, people with a face and a story and a history. And he's done everything he can to show that this is ultimately an issue about people, and that how a country receives the foreigner is ultimately a test of who they are and what they are ethically. I think he's also done one other thing, which is very important, two other things, actually. This year, in February, he signed something called the Abu Dhabi Declaration with the world's leading Sunni Muslim authority, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar in Cairo. And this document is an extraordinary document because it seeks to counteract what one might call the symbiotic forces of, on the one hand, religious fundamentalism and then national populism, which feeds off the other. You know what I mean? A Muslim fanatic plants a bomb, which creates, of course, anguish and terror, and then the populist offers to exclude Muslims from the country as a way of protecting you from that fear. So in order to counteract both the religious fundamentalist and the national populist who claims to defend Judeo-Christian civilization, the Pope and the Grand Imam have basically reclaimed religious leadership, saying, no, religion does not stand for those things, it stands for these things. And one more thing. He has introduced, as probably at the heart of his pontificate, possibly the most important reform is what we call generally synodality, the idea of a kind of dialogue and participation, a model of the church moving together, which he himself said in 2015 could become increasingly a model for a world and a politics which increasingly needs to understand how better to enable ordinary people to participate in the processes and the decisions which affect them.
Thanks. So Ross, let me turn to you for a second. first of all, a couple questions arise from that. I'd love you to give us some background on these conversations about nationalism and liberalism. You've been at the center of them, and I'd love you to give us a little bit of a conversation about a little bit of a rundown of that. But most of all, react to Austin too. We talk about, do you see Pope Francis as in line with Benedict and John Paul II on these kinds of issues? Do you see him moving the ball forward when we talk about globalization by his focus on the face of the migrant? How would you address these questions? What does he bring to the conversation, and how is that conversation going right now?
Well, I mean, the conversation is going badly, but that's sort of a given. I would say, I think, yes, he is on these issues broadly in line with John Paul II and Benedict, but with obviously sort of, on the one hand, a particular focus and emphasis, and I think Austin is obviously right about this, on sort of the specific, the face of the migrant, the plight of the migrant as a kind of almost a Christian icon, you could say. And then joined to that, he's operating in a very different context politically. And that context, I don't know, what's a 3-minute summary of that context? That context, I would say, if you want, since Austin offered the critical take on nationalism, which I think is often fair, I will offer a slightly more sympathetic take, which is basically an argument that the combination of sort of the deep processes of globalization and the particular political and cultural choices of the Western elite have combined and converged in a way that both has worsened or at least left stagnant the economic prospects of a lot of middle to lower middle class to working class people in the Western world, and created a deeper alienation than heretofore existed on a cultural level between the sort of, broadly speaking, governing class of the Western world and this middle to working class population. And that cultural polarization exists along a lot of different axes. And you don't want to overstress the religious element, because one of the forces at work in this sort of working class dynamic is itself a form of secularization, right? The Western working class is more secular than it used to be, which is part of why a more secular form of conservatism like that embodied by Trump can succeed. But still, religion is obviously part of it. If you go to working class neighborhoods in France or the UK or the United States, even if they're somewhat secularized, they're secularized in a different way, and I think are still more residually Christian or Catholic, certainly than, you know, people in Washington, D.C., people in New York, people in London, and so on. And so I think nationalism emerges out of that tangle of economic disappointment and cultural isolation, a sense of cultural decline, a sense of social decline, and so on. And it has many problems, but among its many problems is that it is not, it's more distant from the elite and struggles to find leaders who are not, to be crude about it, bigots and hucksters, right? And in some cases, it doesn't find leaders at all. You have sort of talking about sort of popular movements, you have the fascinating phenomenon of the Gilets jaunes in France, this sort of protest movement that has persisted and taken multiple protean forms over a long period of time without ever finding any sort of clear leadership. So there's clearly a problem of leadership. There's clearly a tempting of nationalism towards darker forces. And this, I'll finish up here, this leaves the Holy Father and sort of the government of the church in a very difficult position. And I should say that as much as I am occasionally a critic of Pope Francis, I do not envy him his job. The Catholic Church is a global church, right? And the Pope is the shepherd of Catholics in residually Christian nations in Western Europe who feel themselves abandoned by or despised by their leadership class, which is itself tends to be extremely pro-immigration and is not engaged in a sort of great replacement conspiracy theory. But I think it's fair to say that the leadership class of the Western world has had an attitude that, you know, immigrants might be a little bit better than their, you know, annoying, bigoted hinterland people from time to time. I think that attitude creeps into elite discourse around the edges. And the Pope has a responsibility to those people as baptized Catholics, as part of his flock. The Pope also has responsibility to the millions and at some point billions of Catholics around the world who are part of the global South, who are more likely to be migrating to the global North and who are seen as a threat but are not, acting as a threat on any particular level. And he has a sort of more general responsibility to promote a Christian approach to migration writ large. And that's a very hard balance to strike, and I'll leave it there.
Well, let me ask you your reaction to this, Leah, and in particular, this idea of sort of a national community, if you will. If we can have something that feels like community around the idea of a nation, but more importantly, I want to put that in your particular context. Leah's so interesting, as I said earlier, she's very hard to pigeonhole in terms of her writing, but I want to talk a little bit about your book, it's called Building the Benedict Option, but I want to read to you how she describes this. She says, my goal always in building the Benedict option is not to turn away from the world, but to awake my faith so that I may live a more Christian life at home and in the world. And you're really focused on building community at a very local level, I think. And so I'd love to hear what you have to say about your reaction to what you've heard, but also, is there a way that we can think about community in this broader sense that will affect real people in their lives where they live them?
Yeah, well, I think one thing I'd say is that I'd encourage everyone who's here, as we're listening to these discussions that kind of span, from our nation to the entire world, to really listen with an ear towards what it is you want to take up and do as the result of coming to this event, which might be, I really want to volunteer for this organization. I want to devote a holy hour to this person I particularly hate, who I think is actively frustrating, the work of Christ in the world. So I need to go to adoration and spend a holy hour praying for them. And to kind of think about that full gamut of what it means to participate in these questions, from volunteering to time in prayer with God. Because I think there's a tendency, certainly in my social circle, to be drawn into the exciting theory of exactly what Pope Francis may do next as a distraction from our own duties that have been placed in front of us. Sure. And you can do that a bit. It's all right if you tweet about Pope Francis, provided you also invite someone to your house for dinner. And you can start with someone you already know and like and work your way out to someone you do not know or do not like or find alienating. But that is a big part of our job. And it's especially part of our job as lay Catholics active in the world with work in front of us. Sure. So that's kind of my contrasting pitch to how much you should think about Pope Francis. But I will take this opportunity to lay down my marker on illiberalism for the panel. Since no one has defined it yet, which means I get to pick. Illiberalism, being a negation of another term, obviously has several possible definitions, so I will pick the one I think is admirable, and then everyone else can pick other ones as needed. I think a lot of the appeal and the good fruit being born out of a discussion of or interest of illiberalism is looking at the way the present liberal order kind of taking the individual as the basic component of society, the individual who should be or aspire to be as unencumbered as possible, is counterproductive, and it's counterproductive because it's false. I really like James C. Scott's book, Seeing Like a State, where he focuses on, what does the state require of us to be legible, to be intelligible to it? And to be concrete about that, I think everyone kind of encounters that not just in the examples Scott pulls out from the more extreme, the state requires you to have a last name, which is a transition for certain societies, to have an address. But we kind of look at the world around us and say, what does the current liberal order expect of us to be legible and to be intelligible to the world around us? And often it's a giving up of dependence or a disavowal of dependence. This comes up most strongly and obviously for women, because women are subject to a very specific kind of dependence and interdependence that cannot be ignored, or it's not possible to be talked out of. And we see a lot of ways that our society is set up to say, okay, well, I guess in extreme circumstances, sometimes people depend on each other, but how can we minimize them so they happen as little as possible? And how can we kind of diminish the level of that dependence? How can we just find a way, to free parents from being at home with their kids, which would be dependence, and find more ways, as Kamala Harris was just arguing, so that they could be safely at work during the 2-hour gap when their kids are done with school for the day, which like, it's a real problem that gap exists. It should be solved by making the parents more legible to their jobs and less available to their children. So I think what interests me most about kind of all the different backlashes we're seeing to the current order isn't nationalism, and it isn't in-depth conversations about Pope Francis by people, broadly. It's pushing back against these liberal assumptions, which are kind of baked into our laws, our social order, which often are rooted in a horror of dependence and a real desire to free people from that, which is fundamentally untrue. And then we'll always push to the margins of a society people who can't fake being not dependent.
Terrific. I'm so glad you brought that up for two reasons. One hallmark of these conversations that have been going on is that women are not really involved in them too often. You don't see those faces up on those panels. And I think it's great that you've brought up the fact that it's often women who are the most interdependent, who are often dependent. And it's both our market economy and our liberal political structures that look to women to be individuals in a way that autonomous, let's put it that way, in a way that they're not. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I think it's terrific. I want to also talk a little bit with you, Matt, about what Leah said regarding abstraction, okay? Because I think you're a great person to get at this. As I said before, Matt started out, I would say, on the right, that's fair to say, has moved to the left.
Yes.
And often what I think of as one hallmark of conservative thought, and I know you've pointed this out in your writing as well, is a resistance to abstraction, is a place of putting conversations in the local and the particular. And Pope Francis does that quite a bit as well. Can you help us think about how we bring these conversations, number one, to the particular political moment we're in and the particularity of people's lives, and also maybe react to what you've heard here so far?
Sure. Well, I think one thing that my work is focused on are the conversations going on the right among conservative intellectuals. And so the question of particularity, it's not just particularity in the sense of the way conservatives might resist abstraction, but also particular things happening right now in this political moment. So before this conversation started, Kim asked us to be generous. And that's not a wind-up to say, anything too mean. But I would say my concern is that some of the conversations around nationalism and whether you want to call it illiberalism, anti-liberalism, post-liberalism, that they're happening when Trump is president, first of all, and when we're seeing movements around the world, people like Viktor Orban being elected in Hungary, some of what's happening in Poland, the kind of populist nationalist backlash more broadly. And my concern is that when you defend nationalism or when you defend illiberalism, you're defending nationalism when there are kids in cages on the border and when families are being separated, to just take an example. And so if you have a whole argument you put forward about nationalism, but don't talk about that and don't distance yourself from it, that's my worry, is that in a way you're providing the intellectual scaffolding for some of these policies and practices. And you're in a way giving permission for these things to be done. And so I would say one more thing about the relationship between nationalism and illiberalism or anti-liberalism, which is that I think nationalism, part of what it does is it defines who the people are and who falls outside that boundary. And then the illiberalism lets you treat the people who fall outside that boundary as essentially not being people with rights or dignity. And for all the criticisms of liberalism you can make as a political philosophy, and as someone on the left, I have my own criticisms of them. I don't want to go behind the liberal insight that we are equal as human beings, and that even as individuals, which is not the same as individualism, as individuals we possess rights and dignity and should be treated a certain way. So in this particular moment right now, those are my concerns, that when you combine the nationalism and the illiberalism, and you have conservative intellectuals defending both the nationalism and the illiberalism. There's a way in which, by not distancing themselves enough from these quite cruel policies we see, they're giving permission for it. And the conference this summer here in DC at the Ritz-Carlton, that populist venue, you could listen to speech after speech, and the descriptions of nationalism or criticisms of our immigration policies would not say anything about what's actually happening right now. And those, I would say, are my basic concerns about these terms and concepts.
Ross, what's your reaction to that? I mean, do you think President Trump is a stumbling block to people who defend this renewed idea of nationalism? Or do you think, given that we've lost lots of mediating institutions, that in fact, the revitalized nationalism is a way to help protect us from the harms of globalization and build a sense of the common good? What do you think about it in this moment?
I mean, I guess, so a couple things, right? So one, I think Matt's absolutely right that there's sort of a style of conservative discourse around these sort of big picture philosophical questions that is evasive at best about some of the realities of populist governance. My general view is that what we've seen from Trump especially, but also some other populist figures, is more incompetence flavored by cruelty than cruelty defined by rigorous competence. And I think the separation, I mean, we don't have to go too far down the rabbit hole, but the child separation policy on the border was a moral disaster. It was also the one policy that the Trump administration was forced to walk back. And the cages are systems that existed under the liberalism of Barack Obama as well, right? So there's sort of, I get in arguments with my liberal friends about just how bad Trump is, but I do think that there are obviously deep moral problems with nationalism as it's practiced that conservatives can avoid by seeking refuge in abstraction. The counter-argument to this, though, is that this is true of the liberal order as well, right? And so you have people standing up and defending the liberal order against the terror of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who have very little to say about the fact that what you might call one of the hearts of liberalism, right, the Low Countries of Belgium and the Netherlands, are practicing an aggressive form of euthanasia that is killing the disabled and the depressed, not in like epic numbers, but in real numbers, right? And yet there isn't a sort of crisis of liberalism discourse about this where people are saying, well, we have to, how can we have the Netherlands and Belgium in the EU when they're obviously violating sort of basic liberal principles of equality and dignity? And, you could run, I mean, we don't have to get into a larger abortion conversation, but you could make a similar argument about abortion, right? The reason that you end up, in certain cases, with a certain kind of conservative Catholic or conservative Christian intellectual making excuses for the cruelties of nationalism is that they think that the cruelties of what we call liberalism are just sufficiently egregious that, you have to vote for Donald Trump. So I think, I don't have like a big takeaway, but those are two responses.
Well, it seems to me, though, there is in fact a crisis of liberalism conversation going on, and it does surround those issues. That's the conversation we're talking about in a sense, right?
The crisis of liberalism conversation, I guess it's a really interesting conversation, and I really like the conversation because I write about these things for a living, right? But I also think it's important to not to not give in too much to the narrative that liberalism is in some sort of decisive crisis. I mean, is Viktor Orban a post-liberal figure, or is he the equivalent of, the de facto periods of one-party rule that you had in Mexico for decades, or in Japan for various periods, right? Like, is the liberal order Brexit, right? Brexit is in certain ways the greatest constitutional crisis that Austin's beloved homeland has ever seen. But if you go to London right now, it doesn't feel like, Britain is about to collapse into tumbrils and guillotines.
We haven't left yet.
Right. Well, right. No, that's fair. But I guess I'd say I'm a crisis of liberalism discourse participator who often wonders about all of these people sitting around writing about the crisis of liberalism from nice coffee shops in prosperous American cities where that crisis, I mean, I think to bring it back to Pope Francis, I mean, I think in certain ways his narrative about liberalism, I mean, it sort of veers back and forth a little bit, right? You can read parts of Laudato Si and come away with the impression that the Pope is a post-liberal who believes this liberal society is unsustainable and headed for a crash. But you can also read portions of the Pope's rhetoric that sort of imply that it is, it's precisely its prosperous stability that's the problem, even as it sort of, has a throwaway culture internally and ignores people at the margins and so on. And I'm not sure which of those is right, but I think there's enough crisis discourse that we should be a little skeptical of the depth of the crisis.
I'm skeptical of the depth of the crisis too, in a way, and yet you do see Viktor Orban using the phrase liberal democracy and talking about
Right, Orban is a participator too, right? Like Orban is a pundit in some weird way. Like there's a phenomenon of like Orban wants, he's a politician and obviously many other things, but he likes to meet with conservative intellectuals. He likes to have speeches that make big statements about how Hungary is leading, the sort of post-liberal move. And again, obviously if there really were a big post-liberal leader, he probably would give speeches like this, so you don't want to discount it. But I also wonder about sort of, what would I do if I became a quasi-authoritarian leader? Maybe I'd give speeches and invite, conservative intellectuals, and it wouldn't all be quite as real as it seemed.
Let me go back to something you said about Laudato Si. I hope that's how it's going on. Let's go back to something you said. When I read Laudato Si, and I want to take this to you, Austin. When I read it, I see Catholic social thought through and through, and I see Pope Francis really engaging with the ideas of the 20th century and the particular moment that we're in right now. And I can't have you two here on this stage without talking a little bit more, engaging a little bit more about the Francis papacy. And I want to just talk about that issue, number one, what you see from Laudato Si and what you see coming from his thought. But number two, it's very, very clear that Pope Francis, as the first Latin American pope, has that through his thought and through his actions. So I'd like to ask you both, is that a feature or a bug?
Is that a feature or a bug? I mean, I think, first of all, Laudato Si is the most compelling account, I would say, that we have of the crisis of liberalism. I mean, the crisis of liberalism conversation I feel like I've been having for years, and Catholics have been critiquing the liberal order for a very, very long time. And of course, when you see people like Orban and Salvini come along, you realize that they're just the flip side of liberalism. So the sovereign individual that Leo was talking about, which is at the heart of liberal discourse, which of course we've had asserted endlessly through all these identity movements, being gay, being transgender, people defining themselves by various characteristics and asserting their rights against the community. Nationalism is the response to that. It's asserting identity of the nation and of the community against that other kind of identity. From a Catholic point of view, though, they're fundamentally the same. I mean, they're flip sides of the same phenomenon. I mean, the important distinction in Catholic social thinking is between the individual and the person. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. So, Catholics understand the person is more or less as Leah described, the individual always in relation to others. So liberalism is the degradation of that ideal, of course, at the level of community. But nationalism is surely the assertion of the sovereign individual transposed onto the level of the nation or the state. So it's the same kind of thing. And I look at the moral bankruptcy of people like Salvini, and let's not even get on to Trump. It seems to me that they're just part of the liberal order and reacting against it. So I don't know, Catholics need to, I think, stand back a bit from all of this and say, what's really going on here? And I think Laudato Si does that. It's an apocalyptic encyclical because it says, if we carry on like this, we're headed for disaster. And actually, since that was produced in 2015, I think we've seen nothing but confirmation. Indeed, things are a lot worse even than the encyclical makes out. The model itself is giving way, is crumbling, even as we speak, and therefore, and all this ferment around us and the dislocation and this new movements are part of that. And we Catholics have to sort of work out where are we going to be swept up in this reactionary, counter movements Or do we stand back and say, a bit like the Catholics had to, and I'm a historian, so forgive me, but back in the 90s and 20s and 30s, this stuff was happening. Breakdown of liberal globalized order. Many Catholics, as I'm afraid many Catholics now, are being tempted down the route of national populism. They're seduced by the Salvinis and Orbans of this world, just as Catholics were seduced by Mussolini and Dollfuss and so on. So I think that's the challenge to us, is to say, are we willing to stand back?
Austin, what do you think are the Holy Father or the bishops or anyone else's pastoral responsibilities towards those Catholics being so seduced?
I think he has the duty to alert them to what's happening and to remind them of what the gospel teaches, and I think he does that extremely effectively.
How about you, Leo?
I'm still enjoying, by the way, the image of you as a dictator, and we're invited.
I know,
we're invited to your salon.
I've made my own evening with that image, certainly.
I'm just picturing the epaulets,
The epaulets.
made
The epaulets.
from rabbits,
Yes.
gilded ones, surely.
What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think where I definitely agree with Austin is that Catholics are called to oppose kind of the liberal order and its errors, and then we have to be careful about not getting swept into an opposition itself dictated by the liberal order and its errors.
Explain that.
I think we kind of have a very silly example of it this week in just the level of hand-wringing about Chick-fil-A altering its donation distribution, which had given to specifically Christian groups, had drawn flack from it, and now is giving to different Christian groups that are less alienating to the gay rights movement. And I saw a lot of memes that I did not need to see, as though a large company was the foremost torchbearer for Christian witness in the United States. And I don't mind that people were upset or had a feeling of affiliation, but I think there's a real sense in which we kind of take our cues of how do we oppose our enemies. Well, let's look to our enemies who we think are fundamentally wrong-headed in their understanding of the world and see what upsets them most, which gives our opposition too much credit. If our opposition were reliably upset most by the truth, they would be halfway to knowing the truth already. And that we kind of, by doing this, miss the opportunity to give a counter witness that is truly informed by the depths of the Catholic faith, which includes the parts that people don't think to get mad at us for because they're ignoring them. For example, I think the Christian witness of chastity and consecrated religious life is a tremendous rebuke to kind of intensely temporal concerns, to the idea of material prosperity as the goal in life, to the goal of independence, when you look at people who are taking vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty. And it is part of our profound witness. The witness of people like Matthew Loftus, a Protestant who's downwardly mobile to live with the poor in solidarity with them, is a counter witness, and it doesn't tick people off in the same way that President Trump does. But it's not reliable to look at the people who are best at irritating our opponents and take them as our guideposts.
I think just
Can I stick up for Chick-fil-A?
let me let you do that in 1 second, all right? Because I want to focus on this idea of counter-witness for a minute, because I think that's something that really brings Catholics together. I think of Dorothy Day as somebody who is sort of the iconic counter-witness, and she brings together right and left, and she very much was a Catholic through and through on economic, cultural issues. It's hard to even talk about it in terms of issues. She lived a life of counter-witness. But Matt, I want to bring you into this for a second, because I want to ask you, I guess following on this question, do you think the problem, the developments we're seeing today, stem more from a failure of us as Christians than from a failure of our politics? Is it our witness that needs to be stronger and more true to the beliefs and principles we share?
I don't know. That's a tough question. Could you say a little more?
Sure. I mean, in other words, do you think we should be living the kind of lives, do you think we're called to live the kind of radical lives of Christian witness in all sorts of different ways that Dorothy Day would live, but even in our own states and in our own places, our own vocations? Do you think if we did that better, our politics wouldn't be as disjointed, our communities wouldn't be as fractured, the poor and vulnerable wouldn't be as left alone? I mean, is that more a cause of it than our politics?
I'm going to say no.
Okay.
Now, obviously, we should try to live out gospel values. struggle to follow Jesus, be as holy as we can. But I think I want to resist the kind of counterpoising our individual lives and individual decisions against structures and actual political arguments and what we need to do politically. Because there are certain things you can only address through collective action. And the biggest of them is the economy. We haven't talked about capitalism much. But I think when you're talking about our search for shedding dependency, when you mentioned Kamala Harris's policy that maybe kept kids at school longer so their parents could work longer, that's not a result of our will to individuality. That's a result of capitalism. And so I really think that as thank you. No, but I really want to resist the idea that if we lived more virtuous lives personally and individually, that would solve these problems. And you weren't necessarily suggesting that, but I think there are certain things you can only address through collective action and at the level of policy. And so I
want to jump back in for one second.
Real quick, go ahead.
Because of course I don't disagree with you, Matthew, on
Right.
that. There's a lot we can only do at the level of policy and at the level of large groups. I think it's important to remember we have to do both.
Sure.
And I think what the individual witness gives us that the politics often don't is a sign of hope and that an alternative is possible. And that's much harder to communicate through legal proposals, which I think is important. But one piece, I love the writings of Eve Tushnet on both kind of friendship and her work at a pregnancy resource center. And one of the discussions that just comes up in what drives people to consider abortion is a sense of responsibility, right? If I can't do right by this child, it would be better not to have it. And the question is, what alternative are people seeing who want, in that moment, to be a responsible parent as they understand it and consider something monstrous as the result? And it's both a matter of policy. There should be more imaginable, and some of that is financial resources, but it's also a matter of witness, of seeing people raise children in difficult circumstances, having that available to you, having solidarity with individuals so it becomes imaginable. And I think that's kind of the startling thing is the number of things people need to have shown to them with specific examples and witnesses that they didn't previously. Is it all right to get married after college? Yes, maybe not for an individual person or an individual couple, but yes, it's fine. And a real fearfulness, especially in my somewhat over-educated and over-ambitious demographic, where there's a waiting to see, has anyone tried this and is it working? And that individual witness is something we can offer because there's a real temptation to fearfulness and despair that has to be dispelled by specific lives lived.
And I think it's great. I think it's great that you said, because it's very true. Obviously, these two things aren't in opposition at all. It's the great Catholic both and, right? And that's what we're about here. But I looked at that woman who's facing a pregnancy, an unexpected pregnancy, and another thing to get back to what Matt was saying that might drive her to consider a monstrous result is the fact that she lives in poverty, that she has an economic system around her where that she can't. She feels like she can't support this baby.
But it's the horrifying thing is it's women in both circumstances, women in poverty and women who already have children who have a certain degree of stability in their life but aren't sure if this is a good idea. We need to address both, but there are a number of women considering this choice who are trying to be responsible to their jobs, right, to their careers. I agree with you about the number of factors pressuring people here. Yeah. And who have some of the material concerns addressed, but not the question of hope.
Sure, absolutely. How about you, Ross? What do you think? Respond maybe to Matt's point here about the fact that we're not talking about collective action. We're not talking as much about these larger economic issues. Do you think we've had a good response to that in these larger conversations?
I mean, I think implicit and often explicit in the discussion about liberalism is a discussion about late capitalism, which is a term I have to call it late capitalism because it's such a wonderful phrase. Middle, yeah. And I think that you see this both in populist policymaking and in some of those sort of high-flown nationalist, nationalist speeches and arguments. And so, I mean, we've just had a series of speeches by Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio, who are probably the most sort of intellectual, populist-friendly of the Republican politicians, that have not gone as far as I would imagine your colleagues at Commonweal would like, but have made sort of critiques of conservatism as it exists that are to some extent rooted in Catholic social teaching, the both and so on. So that exists. The actual specific policies of, to take the extreme examples, the Orban government in Hungary and the government in Poland and so on, have included a lot more weight for social spending directed at families than conservative politics in the US. And even, Donald Trump has governed as a pretty conventional Republican when he's governed at all, but his actual campaign was a mix of un-Catholic cruelty towards outsiders and a shift in Republican rhetoric on social programs that moved the party somewhat in, I think you could say, a more Catholic direction. So I think that
Catholics voted for him in great numbers. How do you account for that?
White Catholics.
White Catholics.
Yeah. But there's something wrong there, isn't there? I mean, surely.
Well, there is, although what's
That he
interesting
capture.
about Trump is that there were all of these predictions that, he would get absolutely wiped out among Hispanic voters. And in the end, he did as well with Hispanics, which was not well, to be clear, as Mitt Romney. And I think there's an interesting dynamic where Trump's birtherism and bigotry probably cost him something with minority voters, and then his economic populism vis-a-vis Romney probably won him something back, and those effectively canceled each other out, and he ended up with Romney levels. I mean, I guess my question for Matt is, I sometimes feel like from the left generally and from the Catholic left, there's a demand for, there's a sort of anti-meliorism, I guess, meliorism meaning, sort of medium-term policy solutions as opposed to broad structural critiques. And, I'm here for all intellectual debate, so I'm certainly here for the late capitalism debate. But the problems that we're talking about obtain in varying ways in Northern Europe, in, the problems of sort of xenophobia and populist politics are palpable in Sweden as Denmark as much as in Italy and Hungary. And I wonder about sort of the it's capitalism move, right, as a sort of way to evade a more specific question like, isn't the best Christian witness that Chick-fil-A does being closed on Sundays, and doesn't that mean we should bring back blue laws?
Yes. Yes, that part is true.
Well, I didn't invoke capitalism as some,
I'm not.
way to
I'm just asking you
evade.
to be a spokesman for the entire left.
Yeah. Sure, yeah. Well, I want to say a few things.
Yeah.
One is that you mentioned Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio. And my worry is that partly you're going to see more people on the right and Republicans start talking the populist game. But if you read or watched Marco Rubio's speech across town at Catholic University of America a week or two ago, there were a few words not mentioned in that speech. One was unions, and another was kind of raising the minimum wage to a living wage. So I think partly what's going on is kind of the cruelties being ignored by actual on-the-ground nationalists and populists, and the economic language is being updated a bit, but there's not a lot of substance there. But Ross, I would be totally happy to think about particular policies in the near term that would improve the lives of working Americans, including blue laws. I wouldn't mind if things were closed on Sundays, but and combine that with a broader structural critique. I just don't think there's that much difficulty in walking and chewing gum at the same time. And but there are people on the left, people like Bernie Sanders, people like Elizabeth Warren, who are offering particular policies that will help working mothers. Universal child care, longer paid maternity leave, a better health care system, include Medicare for all. These are real, this isn't talking about socialism, a way to evade particularity and details. These are real policies that really would help people. And I know that the experience of Europe means that wouldn't solve all of our problems, but I think in the United States, at least, we haven't even tried.
Let me jump in here.
Sure.
Because first of all, hashtag CST nationalism, number one.
Yeah.
And secondly, we're going to get to your questions in a couple minutes, I promise. Just, we're almost there. I have 2 more questions, though. And I want to just let this go on for a second longer. Sure. 2 things. I think that we talk, oftentimes you see conservatives starting to move. We've seen some of the Catholic social thought language, the language of the common good, coming into the conversation. You see that in Marco Rubio's speech. You also see nods to things like paid family leave and other policies like that. Do you think there's a chance, do you think that's window dressing, or do you think there's a real chance of a Republican leader, either congressional or president, following through on those policies in a substantive way?
I would choose neither, in the sense that I think it's not window dressing, right? I think that not only the sort of conservative scribblers who are writing about this stuff, but even many of the politicians who are adopting it are actually concerned about these issues. And I think Hawley and Rubio in particular are quite sincere. They're not sort of trying to come up with window dressing for the next round of tax cuts. That said, I think there are strong structural forces in Republican politics that I have been living with and writing about for my entire professional career that make that kind of effective populist turn challenging. And to those, you have to add all of the sort of media cultural dynamics that Donald Trump has heightened. So, I think one should have a non-cynical read on what these politicians are doing, but I think fundamentally, my friend Michael Brendan Doherty, who writes about these issues from time to time, wrote a piece recently that made a lot of people really upset, where he basically said, look, the most plausible successor to Donald Trump is not Marco Rubio or Josh Hawley, it's Donald Trump Jr. And that's probably not going to happen, but the point, but the point, Tucker's ready for the pro-family policies, man. Yeah. Don Jr. maybe not so much, though he does have a lot of kids. But I think that point is like the sort of, the mix of structural forces that shape conservatism and media entertainment dynamics. They make it hard to say, all right, from Marco Rubio being sincere, we get to a Rubio administration doing the good things that Eastern European populists have done and not the bad things, which is my goal.
Let me...
With epaulets.
With epaulets. Austin, I want to wrap it up with you, and then we're going to go to your questions. We're going to have microphones on either side here, and so when I turn to you guys, just raise your hand, and we're again going to focus on young people, since that's the audience we're reaching for today, just to put that out there.
If there are any children in the audience, we will take your questions
Very young.
first.
We will not, Anna and Tessa will not be carding people, reverse carding people. But Austin, I want to kind of bring this back to you. I think it's wonderful when politicians talk in the language of Catholic social thought, and when they bring together the kind of principles that we all agree on, right? I mean, we all want to work for the common good. We all hold up solidarity with the poor and vulnerable, and a sense of community and interdependence. What's your sense of how those principles can be operative in our current, either your experience in Britain or your experience here? How are those principles operative in public life? And again, through the lens of Pope Francis, do you think he's helping make them more operative or no?
Well, I think there's a shift in this pontificate, and it was clearly announced in a way when Francis was here in September 2015, when he said to the US bishops, don't make of the gospel a source of worldly struggles or an instrument of worldly struggles. And I think what he's been seeking to do in America is a little bit like, again, forgive me for the history lesson, but like Leo XIII tried to do with France in the 19th century, when France was locked in this tremendous culture war, and the Catholics were all aligned effectively with the reactionaries and the monarchists against the revolution. And it was a fruitless struggle between two forces, which ultimately resulted in nothing. And Leo XIII broke through that by saying, you know what, Catholics can live with democracy, it's fine. And in fact, and then Rerum Novarum, which actually allowed the church to turn towards humanity and look at the real concrete needs and wounds of humanity. And I think that's exactly what Francis is seeking to do in the United States. So he's saying, if you wish to be aligned with the Catholic ethical offer, it's not enough just to promise to end abortion, which, by the way, never seems to happen here. But Republican politicians seem to promise it, and half of the country, half the Catholics vote for Republicans in the hope that it'll happen. It never does. Meanwhile, the rest of the country assumes that Catholicism and republicanism have become the same thing. And that's compromised, seriously compromised the US Church's capacity to evangelize. It's compromised its credibility in the public sphere. So Francis has said these other things are also important. Death penalty, immigration, ecology, these are also life issues. It's part of the same ethic of gift and ethic of life. And of course, some people hate him for that. I'm sure many of you do. And you'll object to that because ultimately they see him as compromising what is ultimately the logic of a political campaign rather than the gospel.
I'll give you a chance. Yeah, so obviously let's give you a chance to counter here.
No, well, we've gone through all this without Austin and I really coming to blows. But I think that the dynamic within Rome, the assumption that the reason that American Catholics are troubled by Pope Francis is primarily a reflection of their unflinching loyalty to the demons of capitalism on the one hand and xenophobia on the other hand is profoundly unfair and fundamentally unpastoral, and is the chief pastoral failure. This is what I was getting at with that question earlier. I think the chief pastoral failure of the Francis pontificate is its desire to accuse conservatives first and understand them second. And I think the experience of the American church is a church that is, for all its many manifold sins and flaws, more vigorous in many ways than most of the churches of Western Europe, and a church that did its best, again, with manifold flaws and failures, to put into practice the magisterium of the preceding two popes. And Francis, I think, has a reasonable critique and offers a reasonable corrective to many of the failures of that process and that practice. But I think the dynamic of both the Holy Father and people around him towards Americans who are confused at why Francis sees Germany as more of a model for a church under liberalism than the U.S. is totally reasonable. It's totally reasonable.
He's a fierce critic of the German church. As you know, recently when they held their synod, Francis wrote a searing letter to the Germans.
Of the German church.
I'm going to stop this
This
conversation.
attempt to paint Francis as a liberal is just not going to succeed, Ross. It never does.
And I'm going to stop this because I want to take it back to, I think we've heard from both of you on this, and I think it's an important conversation to have. But I actually want to bring it back to you, Leah, before we go to questions. Because I think this conversation, right, this abstract, high-level conversation is frankly something that, do you see that in you work on a college campus, you work in a campus ministry, right, you help with those programs. Do you think this is something that would attract folks to a Catholic social thought, or do you think it's the witness? Do you think Francis is somebody that attracts them to our church?
I think, let me say the thing I like best about Francis, the thing I find most frustrating, and then Austin and Ross can both yell, but just wordlessly one last time,
Okay.
And then we'll go to questions. I think his tremendous pastoral heart with individuals is something that struck people from the beginning of his papacy, and that whereas the thing where I most saw non-Catholics or fallen away Catholics getting excited about him. I really liked, and Austin, I'm sure you can supply the book title because I've forgotten it, his writings to priests prior to becoming Pope, Open Mind, Faithful Heart. I know it's mind and heart, but I forgot in what order and which adjectives. Where he just talks very concretely, the pastor who is getting ready for his homily on Sunday and then is interrupted by an annoying old woman who wants him to come bless her house. He has to go do it, right? That's his job. And I think that's very clear in his way of approaching the world. It's the reason there was the jokes/rumors about whether he was sneaking out of the Vatican to minister to people. And people find that attractive. And the thing to remember is there's no reason they should find it attractive only about Francis. Like, all of your friends should wonder if you sneak out of your job and minister to people, right? Like, there's a real hunger for that, and everyone has the opportunity to give that witness. However,
Right.
when I pray with a friend, no one reports on our discussion of her particular circumstances and then discusses whether it's a bellwether for the whole church. And I think there's a lot of kind of care you take for people individually and pastorally that doesn't translate well to being an international figurehead. And that there's a real extent to which there's been confusion and distress caused, both kind of by inadvertent, pastoral ministering becoming, is this a sign for the whole church? The casualness of the press conferences on airplanes, with what is a hostile and distorting press, that then leads people to say, is the church changing its teaching on this? What's going on? I heard Pope Francis has said this, and my personal thing is, I don't read anything about what Pope Francis has said for a week, because there's always kind of reversals and arguments for the first week. I, as a layperson, profit nothing by being involved in that first week of dispute, and then I check in afterwards.
Sure, I hear you. And Matt, I'm going to let you have the last word on this, and then we're going to go to questions. But I do want to say something. I do want to say that because I can see Austin over there wanting to jump in, and rather than say this, I'm going to say this.
I have too much to say.
Yeah, I know, and I think what I would resist a little bit about that account would be the idea that that Pope Francis is trying to stay, sort of be an international figure.
I don't think it's
I gotcha. And I also want to say that sort of this search for this focus on clarity is really truly not what he's about. And then I hear that you have a distinction there, but I think that Austin would have more. Matt, I'm going to let you finish, and then we're going to go to you. Last thing, help us wrap it up.
Sure. I want to say something in favor of Pope Francis, or something I admire about him that might be able to bring us together, although it is somewhat of a criticism of what you just said, Leah.
All right.
But I think when I think of Pope Francis, I think of mercy. And the reason people have been drawn to him, and the reason he generates the kind of attention I think that he does, that people sit up straighter in their chairs and notice him, is because when he hugs a man who's disfigured with boils on his face, and treats people with kindness and generosity, and emphasizes mercy, that is something we all hunger for. Mm-hmm. But I would say that is directly connected to his role as an international leader, and that mercy is what connects both his more pastoral individual actions and what he's asking us to do in the world at the level of politics and policy and the way we try to shape our lives together. And that mercy is the connective thread there. And the reason to have an economy that doesn't kill is because that's unmerciful in a way too. And in the midst of so much loneliness and suffering and struggling, mercy is what he's calling us toward. And I think we should reflect on how that is not just a personal attribute, but something that could infuse the way we live together at a more structural and policy level too.
I think that's a great place to end this. And I think that, and as we move to your questions, of course, because I think what you're saying is that Pope Francis doesn't bury the lead of the gospel. He leads with mercy. He leads with care for the least of these. And that's a good, I think, counterpoint to end it here. Let's go to your questions now. Please raise your hand if you have a question. What I'd like to say, John always says, please phrase your question in the form of a question. I'll say it that way. And I'll also say, if you can't say it in 2 or 3 simple sentences, let's save it for the reception afterwards, okay? Anna, how about next to you?
Hey,
and
thanks.
Excuse me for 1 second. When you please stand up and please identify yourself.
Hi, my name's Steve Burke, just a community member. Want to bring it back a little bit to synodality and just kind of what we can get out of this sort of thing. One of the things I was really interested in a couple weeks ago was Bishop McElroy from San Diego. There was a lot of news about this youth synod that he convened, and I know we had this Amazon synod, and kind of putting aside the whole Amazon and ecological sin discussion for a second, is that a way forward, both for the church itself, and I think this is an Austin question, but to all of you as well, a way forward for both the church and for dioceses and for parishes and for young people?
And to you, Austin, but let's unpack the word synodality a little bit more for people.
No, fair enough. And a lot of people say synodality is an unfortunate word. Can't we find another word for it? The problem is that synod is a lovely old ancient church word. Synodos, the Greek, means walking together. And I've reported on the last few synods of this pontificate, and they're fantastic. They're brilliant. It's a place where bishops come together and they start not with how do we declare this doctrine in a new way, but rather what is the needs of a community, what is the needs and the pains, why are we having difficulty evangelizing, or in the case of the family, what are the needs of the family, how hard it is to live in dissolubility in the world. In other words, you start from the human reality, which is always involves a little bit looking at the society that we've become. Then you take church tradition and teaching and you kind of put them together, and there's a process of discernment. Now people find the word discernment a little bit difficult. It's simply looking for where the Holy Spirit is speaking to us in this time. And the brilliant thing about the synods is that they have allowed that to happen, and the church has moved forward. It hasn't changed its teaching. The teaching remains the same. but the pastoral application of that teaching, it has opened up new paths. And the great achievement of the synods is just that. It enables the church to evangelize more effectively in the modern era. I was at the Amazon Synod, and it was a beautiful synod, whatever you may have read about it, with a bizarre, strange kind of reporting that went on around these wooden figurines, which, by the way, were just wooden figurines from the Amazon, but somehow here it turned into pagan idol worship and all sorts of things. But the synod itself was about how the church can get close to the people of the Amazon, how the church can be better present in this area of the world, which is so crucial. And it resulted in a remarkable document and a remarkable process. And it brings people together. So McElroy's article, which I thought was brilliant, the best diagnosis, I think, of the US church that there's been for a long time from a bishop, he was at the synod, he came back from the synod, he said, this is the answer for the US church. It's not just the answer for the US church, it's the answer for the church in Europe and everywhere else. Because we need to have that dialogue, that process of listening, that inductive kind of theological method, where we're not just throwing things at people, but we're listening to them and we're applying things in a discerning way. And this is an incredibly polarized church, and it needs synodality to break through that polarization.
It is a question of how to break through the polarization, for sure. You don't want to go to another question? I'll give it to you, Leah. Tessa, over by Anna, what about you? Go ahead, right there.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Caleb Weaver. I'm also a community member. I'm curious what Ross thinks about this, but it really could be for anybody. Staying with the Amazon Synod for a minute, the sort of the assertion of like indigenous identity, or like Pope Francis' emphasis on racial justice, is that, I'm just curious how you see that relating to this discussion of liberalism, because on the one hand, it could be sort of just a reification or a continuation of liberalism to believe that we can allow for these different identities to all sort of go together. But then it was also suggested that like the reaction against that, maybe they're just liberals too. But, the sort of ugly reaction to the Amazonian Synod and what's going on in Bolivia right now, that very like revanchist reaction to it, I guess I'm just, they can't both be liberalism. So I'm just curious how you see.
It's all liberalism, man.
I'm not convinced.
I mean, let me try an interpretation that's probably wrong and suggest that there is, I think, a clear way in which championing the rights of indigenous peoples against sort of the global economy, global capitalism, late global capitalism, is, if not post-liberal, at least a corrective to liberalism. And in that sense, to the extent that that's the purpose of the Amazonian Synod, I think that it is, again, I think it's sometimes more useful to think of like, are we offering sort of an internal corrective to the liberal system rather than leaping to say, we're post-liberal, we're illiberal or something. And I think that that's true. I guess I would differ with Austin, but I think we fundamentally agree that sort of identity politics of the left and right, I don't think it's a creation of liberalism. I think it's a reaction against some of the obvious flaws of liberalism, but we agree that there is sort of a dialectic or a dynamic there. I think the challenge with the Amazonian Synod is similar to the challenge that I was somewhat intemperately presenting to Austin, which is that you get the feeling when you are maybe too deep inside conservative Catholic worlds, which is always possible to be, that there is a sort of dismissive attitude towards sort of seemingly normal Catholic concerns about things that happen in the process of, let's say, synodality, right? So I think there's a very complicated zone of enculturation and debates about syncretism and all of these things that go on wherever the church is in mission territory. And I am not an expert on the Amazonian region, and I don't think I have very much to offer on sort of the status of enculturation and syncretism in Catholic practice there. But when in this process the church then centers sort of rituals and iconography from a region, it ceases to just be a regional issue and becomes, because the church is global and sort of inevitably global, it becomes a global gesture and a global statement, and as it should be, right? That the purpose of doing the Amazonian Synod is to bring the Amazon to the center of global discussions generally, and to church discussions in particular. And if in that process there is a, what seems like a sort of ritualistically ambiguous action involving an ambiguous statue, it seems totally reasonable to me for Pope Francis and the Vatican to be able to come out with a statement that just says, this was an indigenous icon of the Virgin Mary being used to represent the Virgin, and maybe it has some other implications as well, instead of cycling through a series of statements that all sort of had the impression of, leave us alone, you annoying trads. And what my takeaway from the Amazon Synod was, it was sort of, I fall into a kind of despair where something happens in the center of the church that a traditionalist faction within the church seizes on as terrible, and then it feels like there are people in the Vatican who are determined to make sort of normie conservative Catholics believe that the trad interpretation is correct. So that's, go ahead. Yes, I've said enough.
2 minutes.
I was at the Synod and I was at the press briefing every day, and I simply don't recognise your description of the Vatican response as go away annoying trads. What they said was this is
They
not...
didn't literally say
No,
that.
but they didn't even imply it. They just said, they said, it's not the Virgin Mary, it's not a pagan idol, it's just a wooden figurine they brought from the Amazon, like they brought the canoe, like they brought other things. And they were astonished that it could be interpreted in this way, and I think they should have probably had a better narrative than they did about exactly where it came from. It took us a few days to find that out. But nonetheless, that became the talking point of the right-wing Catholic media here every day in the Synod. Is this not an idol? And the Vatican grew understandably exasperated with the insistence of the question.
Let's move on to a different question, because I do want to move on. I just want to say that, I cut you up before. Go for it.
I do want to comment a little on synodality without commenting on the idol, in part because
it wasn't the idol.
The idol. Without,
if you come to my house, Leah, you'll find lots of objects that are not the Virgin Mary. They are not idols.
Without commenting on it,
They're
because
just
what I do agree with Ross on is that I, as someone who was trying to follow what was going on, could never get a clear sense from Vatican sources.
It's because of EWTN.
Well, I'll skip the. As I said, I'm trying to get past
That's the
that.
filter. The problem here is the filter.
Let's move on. Let's move on right now. I hear you.
If you read Commonweal, you would have known.
I'd like to comment on the synodality question, but
okay. No, let's move on if that's okay. Can we?
Sure.
Okay. Finish it up. Go ahead.
I think there's a profound wound in the church when every announcement of a new synod is greeted with nervousness on multiple sides. I don't even think there are only two within the church about what is at stake in the synod and how shaky is the ground of our church.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I disagree with the point, but what I understand you hearing, what I understand you saying is that it's a time of, it's a mess. There's not a easy solution here or a need.
I don't think it's a fully general mess. I think one of the tensions is what Matthew was highlighting about the question of mercy and what it consists of, is dispensing people from Stricture's mercy or not.
And mercy is messy. I think that's
There is nothing in this pontificate that has ever called for any kind of letting go of core Catholic doctrines.
Exactly.
Or Scripture. Mercy and doctrine are not in contradiction.
Mercy and doctrine are
is
not
not
in
the
contradiction.
dilution of doctrine. Mercy is the doctrine.
And so let's wrap it up. It's true. And I think that is probably the central message of the Francis pontificate, is that that mercy is central Catholic doctrine. One last question here before we wrap it up. Could you stand up and get a mic and let's identify yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Emily McBrien. I just wanted to push on that a little bit. And Matt, you also talked about mercy in very abstract terms. I mean, to say that mercy is a doctrine, what does that mean exactly? Sure. And how does that sort of respond to or include the points that Ross and Leah made about what often seems to be a unmerciful attitude towards conservatives? Ross, your point about kind of attacking first and understanding later. How does the mercy of Francis respond to those things? And kind of often maybe not intentional, but confusing language that Francis can use that would be very easily clarified by a statement from the Vatican. In a certain sense, that could be seen as unmerciful. So I guess I'm just looking for a little less vagueness and ambiguity, a little bit more definition of what that means to say mercy is the doctrine.
And I'm going to let you start with that, Matt. Can you start?
Sure. I mean, I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to go in a long discourse about mercy. But I will say, to speak to your point more generally, I'm really, and I don't mean to kind of point back to what was just said, but I think your question invites that, which is the source of the confusion is what? Yeah, exactly. Is it the people who take a video and then put it on LifeSite News or some other website, say it's a pagan idol? Who's actually causing the confusion? Are normal Catholics, everyday Catholics, looking at screenshots of ceremonies at the Vatican, looking for what the wooden figure might actually be? Or I don't know. My strong sense is that is not the case, that the confusion on the ground is ginned up by people whose financial, there's money involved, there's web traffic involved, and people make money off that. And
Just to say one example, speaking to a reporter who doesn't record interviews or take notes on multiple occasions seems to be one source of confusion that is not coming from social media or the way we're receiving.
you're talking about the Italian journalist,
Yes.
Whose name
Eugenio Scalfari.
No, I just don't have a problem with Francis sitting down and having a conversation with someone he finds interesting. And if you think that Francis is abandoning core Christian doctrine because this Italian journalist kind of floated a few weird lines in something he published, I don't know. I don't quite know how to respond to that other than I think there's a lot of almost conspiratorial thinking about Francis that assumes the very worst of him. And I don't share that perspective.
Well, and I think it's also fair to say that we have so much access these days. We have so much access via social media, via other kinds of media, to both the Pope and to all of these conversations that they get amplified in a way that they never would have before. I also think what I have taken from my experience working for the church, in particular, is a really renewed sense of the global nature of our church. And that these kind of conversations that we're having here right now, the Americans, I think, are 4% of the global church. And I think that these kind of conversations are part of what we should be talking about. And at the same time, I think that it's also important for us to take our focus outward as well to what's going on the ground in other places. I'm going to ask for one last question, and then we're going to wrap it up. Once again, I really want to thank everybody for being here, and I think it's been a really interesting and productive conversation.
Hello, my name is Melvin. I'm a recent graduate of Georgetown. And so my question isn't posed to a particular panelist. Anyone who feels strongly about the issue can feel free. My question is in regards to secularism and how that influences both liberalism and nationalism. We see on both sides of the political aisle either the left becoming more secular in both its rhetoric and in its constituency, and on the right either a sense of like certain Christian denominations becoming more and more ideologically constrained, or just secularism also developing on the right as well. So to what extent do you think that nationalism, that a more religiously founded nationalism or a more religiously founded liberalism is the solution, or maybe do you think that isn't enough to quell the divide?
I'll take a swing at that.
Okay.
Because I want to talk about what I admire most in kind of a secularist tumult at the moment, and how it touches on the question of what mercy is. I think where we see an enormous amount of kind of strife and longing is in the question of how do we seek justice, and what is it possible to do with people who have done terrible things, things that they cannot adequately make restitution for. We're confronting it as a nation as a whole. when we look back at historical wrongs, and then individuals, particularly within the Me Too movement, and looking at people who have sexually exploited or preyed on women. And in secular culture, there isn't a very clear answer to that question, which is why we kind of wind up with the questions of, well, do we purge them? Do they sit out stand-up comedy for a year, but then they come back? Like, and there's a real floundering. And the reason I want to bring this back to the question of mercy is because mercy is not a word that's generically interchangeable with kindness, right? Mercy is about transgression first, and then the reception of the prodigal son. When we receive the stranger at our door, that's not mercy, that's justice. That's the food in our closet that belongs to them by virtue of their need. So when we talk about mercy, we're talking about people who have done wrong and are in some way being reincorporated into the body of Christ. And what we have to offer that secularism does not is an honest account of both sin and grace. And I think where you kind of see a lot of the excesses and errors are people who are frantically trying to disavow sin because they don't believe in grace. So surely this person can't be a really bad person, because if they're a really bad person, oh gosh, we don't have anything to do with those people. Or forgiveness is impossible because what this person did is bigger than they can make restitution for. And how could justice ever be satisfied? And that's a real question, and the answer to it is the crucifixion.
That's a good answer, and I fundamentally don't disagree with it, except that what you've pointed out, which is that sometimes mercy is asserted by some at the expense of truth. The same is also true on the other side. Truth is sometimes asserted at the expense of mercy. In other words, because we believe in this core truth, therefore we cannot treat that person with mercy. You've asked about the doctrine of mercy, and I think, can I give you an answer? Because I think this is really important. Mercy is about sin, it's also about suffering, it's about weakness, it's about failure. The word in Latin is misericordia. Cor means heart, miseri means poor in every sense, suffering. So the one who is merciful is one who has a heart for the poor in every sense, whether the pain, the poverty of sin, or the poverty of injustice. And therefore, the stance, the approach that we take when we embody mercy in our response is we are emulating the response of the divine response to a suffering humanity, which is the incarnation. The incarnation is the synctacabasis, the coming down to come close. And what Pope Francis has put at the core of his pontificate, totally in tune with John Paul II and Benedict, who also were very strong on this. But he's really put at the heart of his pontificate that the Christian has to learn to emulate that very action in order to evangelize, in order to proclaim the gospel, that people must first know that love. People must first know that embrace, the person at the door, the welcoming. Because no change can begin to happen until you've first been welcomed and you first know that love. It's a bit like, as Cardinal Bergoglio once said, truth is like a precious stone. When you offer it in your hand, which is, in other words, mercifully, it's captivating and compelling. If you throw it at somebody, it wounds them, it bruises them. It's the same truth, it's the same stone in both cases. But offering truth without mercy is to bruise people, and that's what so often, sadly, Catholics and the Church has done in the contemporary world. So I think what this pontificate has done is without in any way compromising truth, and I think there's a tremendous clarity about this pontificate, and I totally agree with Matt. People who say they're confused are being told that they're confused. I spent a lot of time, I've been in communications for years, I spent a lot of time on television explaining Benedict, who was constantly misunderstood by the media, constantly misunderstood also by Catholics, often liberal Catholics, and who also, by the way, had the same sense of grievance. Why is it that these, Benedict and this Pope is always so rude to us and doesn't understand us? So that sense of grievance and victimhood was common among liberal Catholics under Benedict and John Paul II, and it's common now among conservatives under Francis. It's the same thing, basically. But in both cases, we have popes who preach the truth, and in both cases, we as Catholics have to do a very difficult job sometimes of explaining what they really mean to a society which has filters, and sadly a church which also has filters which prevent their reception.
I'm going to close it up here, and I think what we're going to do is take this conversation upstairs. But I feel like it's been a really robust conversation, and that to me is going from, it's a very Catholic thing to say, right, that we're going from political issues, which is where we started, down to really issues at the heart of our faith. And I think that what we're here at the initiative about is trying to bring those two things together in public conversation. What you've seen from this group of people tonight is, again, how robust our contribution as Catholics to that conversation is. Tomorrow night, the initiative has another robust conversation going on. It's over in Dahlgren Chapel on Georgetown's main campus. It's Archbishop Wilton Gregory of Washington, D.C., Helen Alvarez, who is a longtime leader in the pro-life movement, a law professor, advisor to the Vatican and the bishops, and John Carr will all be in conversation. I'll be moderating that conversation as well. And we'll also be talking about Pope Francis and carrying on some of these themes, carrying on this conversation. I look forward to you all coming and joining us tomorrow night as well. Please help me thank our panelists tonight. I thought this was a great conversation.